From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Voters in Chicago fire Mayor Lori Lightfoot as the U.S. Senate prepares to vote on whether to disapprove the D.C. City Council's overhaul to its criminal code. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Colin Levy and columnist Kim Strassel. Lori Lightfoot is the first Chicago mayor to lose re-election in 40 years, and the final returns don't even seem to be that close. Recall, there are two candidates who will move on to an April 4th runoff. And out of the 9 candidates on the ballot Tuesday, Lightfoot came in third with only about 17% of the vote as of the figures as we have them right now. Let's listen to a clip of her concession last night. And I must say, at least then, done pretty gracefully.
Obviously, we didn't win the election today, but I stand here with my head held high and a heart full of gratitude. And regardless of tonight's outcome, we fought the right fights and we put this city on a better path. No doubt about it. It's been the honor of a lifetime to be mayor. There's more work to do. And I just want to say thank you all deeply, deeply from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Colin, what do you make of this loss by Lightfoot, and what should listeners know about these two finalists that are now moving on to a runoff in April?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Kyle, I don't think that Lori Lightfoot's loss was a huge surprise. She was dealt a tough hand by COVID for sure, but she had a lot of failures in her tenure, and she was just constitutionally incapable of making peace or building any alliances. But as we've talked about before, this election was certainly about crime, and that's certainly why Lori Lightfoot lost, because she just sort of kept saying that things were getting better. But unlike other issues that you might not be able to see day to day, for people, crime is visible. You can't fool people about it into thinking that the situation is something different than what they feel when they're walking down the street. So I think that's why that really rang hollow. Listening to her concession speech just now, by the way, it does sort of give a bit of a pang because Lori Lightfoot came in as a change candidate. That's why people liked her. That's why she swept all 50 wards last time around. So this time she was the incumbent, and it just felt a lot different.
And what do you expect as we near this April runoff? What are the pitches that each of these two candidates are making to voters? And does one or the other of them represent a real turn in Chicago's direction?
The two in the runoff now are Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallas. They're two very different candidates. They're probably on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Brandon Johnson, I think he's the real story today. Everyone was expecting Paul Vallas to make it to the runoff. Brandon Johnson is the candidate of the Chicago Teachers Unions. And the fact that he advanced to the runoff in April is absolutely a testament to the power of the unions, both in terms of their ability to turn out the troops and their ability to raise just an incredible amount of money. No one knew this guy. He had no name recognition. He's the Cook County Commissioner, and now he's got a serious shot at being the next mayor of Chicago. And if he wins, by the way, he's going to owe the unions big. I mean, he's going to owe them huge, and they know that. The teachers union has their major contract coming up for renegotiation in 2024. And they really want him there because they really want to be on both sides of that negotiating table. So that's what that was all about. I'd expect their buy-in with him to get even bigger going forward. The other candidate, obviously, Paul Vallas, he definitely won this race facing the crime issue head on. And people understood that the current situation where Chicago has, I think it's a 5% arrest rate for major felonies. A lot of times police don't even chase. And you've got 53% of officers that are assigned to beats and many of the other ones who aren't. It's just not the answer. So one thing I wanted to mention about Paul Vallas, though, I thought he did a very smart thing in his speech last night. He tried to essentially tie the crime issue and the safety issue to the Chicago schools. He said that they needed to be sort of addressed holistically and that, there would be no real progress in the city until the schools become part of the public safety solution. So I think that's a good theme. Just
to give listeners the numbers, so Paul Vallas was the top candidate with about 34% of the vote. These, again, are the returns as we have them right now. Looks like about 5% of ballots yet to be counted. And then Brandon Johnson, number 2, with about 20% of the vote. So that leaves nearly half of voters who picked somebody else. And those top two candidates will now be trying to attract their supporters. Kim, the thing that I think that's interesting about this as a non-Chicagoan is I wonder if we may end up with another data point here in liberal city revolts. And I'll mention a couple. One was the San Francisco voters' decision to fire the progressive prosecutor Chesa Boudin recently. And another was the mayoral victory in New York of Eric Adams, who was not the most progressive candidate in that mayoral race to succeed Bill de Blasio. So, Kim, that's what I have my eye on, is whether this is another data point in the trend of progressive cities that eventually go too far, even for a lot of the liberal voters who live there.
I agree. And I don't think we're done seeing that yet. And in some ways, maybe this is an obvious point to make. Sometimes it's worthwhile, nonetheless, stepping back and making the obvious points. But this is essentially a number of liberal cities and leaders who are simply failing the test, right? And as Colin noted, it happened to be a bigger test in the last couple of years because of COVID. But there were also other things like the riots that we saw and the arson and the destruction after what happened to George Floyd. And in moments like this, yes, they are difficult, but that is when citizens look to their leaders most to keep things under control. And instead, in places like Chicago or San Francisco or New York, you had leaders that were letting the lunatics run the asylum. Not only did you have these soaring crime rates, but all the knock-on effects as well, too, in the economy. You know, look what happened to Chicago's Magnificent Mile, those empty storefronts there. Those are jobs that are lost. You've had a number of high-profile businesses that have very publicly exited the city and the state. And even though Lori Lightfoot was insisting that things were getting better, I mean, it's true, homicides were down slightly from their peak in 2021, but robberies are up and thefts are up and burglaries are up, and people live with this every day. I think one more thing that's worth noting, just an interesting aspect of Chicago compared to other places, is that in a lot of places like San Francisco, you've had city councils really neuter the power of mayors to do much at all. They kind of run everything. The mayor in Chicago still has very sweeping powers and responsibilities. And that can be good if you are the mayor, but it can be really problematic if you're not getting the job done because voters know exactly who to blame. And that is what we certainly saw here yesterday.
And it seems like a hard thing to be fighting as a politician. I mean, inflation is another example of an issue that I think voters feel so viscerally that even if it's not your fault, it is hard being the person in charge when the inflation figures are going haywire. Voters are looking for somebody to hold accountable for that. And as Kim mentioned, the homicide rate in Chicago has dropped some, but this is a Reuters story on Lightfoot's loss. It says there were more than 800 murders in Chicago in 2021, the most in a quarter century. The homicide rate dropped 14% in 2022, but remained nearly 40% higher than in 2019. And so, Colin, I think one of my takeaways here is that progressive candidates are underrating the crime issue and how angry voters have gotten about what's going on in some of these cities.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's going to be very interesting, again, on the Chicago race as we watch the runoff, because Brandon Johnson has made it sort of a political goal. Defunding the police, he said at one point, was a political goal. And I think you're not going to have as much tolerance on that, especially from the Black community. You know, if you look at the turnout at the results from the primary, Lori Lightfoot actually beat Brandon Johnson in Black areas. Brandon Johnson's strongest ward was one of the whiter wards in one of the most progressive areas of the city, which is sort of over on the northwest side. So I think that as we go forward, addressing those crime issues is not as easy as just saying, oh, well, Paul Vallis is the, more straight ahead police candidate. It also has to do with people's real feelings of what progressive politics means in their city writ large.